I'd just like to echo that, if I may, and say that it is an absolutely wonderful book. Because what it does is it tells you the story of the 1832 Great Reform Bill. You suddenly see why it matters that this thing happened, and in the course of a very short space of time, I mean 220 pages or something, you get introduced to all these extraordinarily interesting, amusing, sometimes rather raffish characters. So I suppose what I'd like to begin by asking Lady Antonia is, why does it matter so much, 1832?
1832 matters because it was the beginning of a certain kind of government. And when I say the beginning, all beginnings are small. That's obvious. But a certain kind of government where it wasn't just powerful people getting their heads together, occasionally knocking their heads together and deciding what to do, but where account was taken of something called the people. Now, the people in those days were probably divided in the idea of the authorities, divided into the people, good people, people like we see here today, people like me and Andrew, and bad people who were the mob. And the mob, I think, the modern equivalent of the mob are rioters, actually, of which we've all seen quite recently. And it was very odd for me. I was writing all the bits about the rioters in 1831 at a time when riots suddenly started to happen, and it was one of those creepy things that I think, if you write history, and it may have happened to you too, when you're writing something, you know, and you can't believe you haven't brought it about. Like a sort of and if I'd known I could bring it about, I can assure you I wouldn't have brought about riots.
So all these earnest questions on Radio 4, why have the Tottenham riots begun? Is it to do with social problems? Is it to do with, actually there's this witchcraft happening from Notting Hill. That you were bringing it into being. That's a new footnote to history. But let's check. Now you've mentioned the mob. I mean, I think what's so interesting about it, and the whole business really from about 1830 onwards, you start with the fall of one king, Charles X, in France, and the end of the Bourbon autocracy, and the death of our king, George IV. And what I never really saw so clearly until I read this book is, were the Whigs who eventually took over, were they just thinking, this is a ludicrous system of government that we've got, a voting system for, obviously most famously, the rotten boroughs and so forth, places which didn't actually have any inhabitants but sent two MPs and that sort of thing. Was it simply, in a way, their rationality, or was the mob, so-called, lurking there after the experiences of the French Revolutions, both revolutions, making them feel they had to reform, otherwise we would be going the way of France? I mean, where does the balance lie?
I think with all great events there are numerous elements, and it's left to people like me many years later to try and decide which were the most important ones. I think the French Revolution of 1789 was enormously important and filled everybody, including people who'd saluted it. But when the terror came, it filled everyone with a kind of horror of revolution. And then there are the Napoleonic Wars, which finally we are victorious at Waterloo. And then you get the new French Revolution of 1830, which gets rid of Charles X, Bourbon, as you said, and brings in Louis Philippe. This is all to explain that revolution was in the air. And if there are revolutions going on in Europe, going on in France, across the Channel, you know, you don't feel revolution can never come. So I think revolution was a general fear of revolution.
And indeed, it's, there's every reason, if you look at Britain in the late 1820s, why a revolution might well occur. The Duke of Wellington's speech when in the House of Lords, when the idea of reform was mentioned, is really one of the things which starts this book off, isn't it? Tell us a bit about that and what he said. Yes,
I will, but I would like to say part of the scene setting. William Cobbett, the great radical, said, no man ever agitated on a full stomach. And I think that's very important, and I can see people nodding.
Yes.
And I think the economic distress after the Napoleonic Wars, guess what? Soldiers came back from the war wanting jobs, and there weren't jobs. There were naturally bad harvests. There would be, and the country was in a state of economic distress.
And then there were these things called the Captain Swing.
Well, those were, as a result, they were Captain Swing riots, agricultural riots of agricultural workers who've been put out of work by machines, you see. This is the problem. And again, these are things we can identify with. Industrialisation comes along.
Added to which we have the great cities, none of which were represented in Parliament, the growing cities, Birmingham, Sheffield, Manchester and so on. All this is the background, isn't it?
This is, I mean, the electoral background is really extraordinary. I've been telling people about it when I was writing the book during the 3 years. And I would say, all right, guess how many votes Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield had, and they would guess. They could see there was a sort of trap, like when somebody asks you to guess how much something cost, you don't know whether you're supposed to guess sort of 50p or £500. But anyway, some people guessed 3, some people guessed 30. Nobody guessed the truth, which is none. None of those great cities had any votes at all. I mean, I still find it, after 3 years of working on this book, isn't it extraordinary? Now, cut to Dulwich, which happened to be under the sea, it had fallen into the sea, and Old Sarum, which happened to be a green mound, nothing wrong with the green mound. Now, you can probably get this one. How many MPs did Old Sarum send to Parliament?
2.
2, you got it, somebody knew. You see, that puts the thing in the nutshell. This is not a situation anybody planned. The system by which MPs, constituencies were divided, grew up from the Middle Ages, and it was last sort of revised in 1760, which takes no account of Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, the great, as Andrew said, the great industrial cities, which were full of workers, middle-class people, as we might call them, hard-working, good citizens contributing to the country, and they don't send MPs to Parliament. Now, we can see that this can't go on forever. But you see, when something has gone on forever, people at the time can't really see it so easily. And really, my historical motto, which I quote at the beginning of the book, is the words, there was a great historian called F.W. Maitland, who said, we must always remember what now lies in the past, once lay in the future. And that is my motto. I think that is the only way to write history. Do you agree?
Yes, I totally agree. And I mean, one of the shocking things about this book is the, to our minds, absolutely idiotic speeches being made, particularly in the House of Lords, against reform. Particularly, I regret to say, by the bishops of the Church of England, all of whom emerged totally deplorably from this story. And the 2 archbishops particularly badly. But what they saw was the mob and the French Revolution and mass murder coming here. If you open the door an inch, rather than seeing that it was obviously perfectly reasonable, as the American revolutionaries had seen 60 years before, 55 years before, that if you can't tax people unless they're represented in Parliament. And it became as simple as that, didn't it? But the actual process by which this was driven forward, you have to read this book to discover.